You don't get out over your skis, and all of a sudden the brass band is too loud and there's no way you can turn it down.
For over 6 decades, Jimmy Webb has been one of America's most gifted songwriters, the man behind timeless hits like Wichita Lineman, MacArthur Park, and By the Time I Get to Phoenix. His lyrics painted love, heartbreak, and loneliness with poetic beauty that only true artistry can deliver. But behind the elegance and melody, Jimmy carried opinions as sharp as his pen, and he wasn't afraid to share them. Now, at 79, after years of silence about the darker side of the music industry, Jimmy Webb is finally opening up. And this time, he isn't holding back. In a new series of candid interviews, the legendary songwriter revealed the 6 bands he absolutely could not stand, artists who, according to him, lost the soul of music in the noise of fame. From clashes over songwriting ethics to personal betrayals and creative disputes, Jimmy's reasons go far beyond simple dislike. Some of these groups insulted his craft. Others represented the very trends that buried the art of true storytelling in music. As he put it bluntly, there was a time when music had meaning, and then there were these guys who turned it into a circus. In this exposé, we uncover the truth behind Jimmy Webb's controversial statements, the 6 bands he hated most, why he felt so strongly about them, and how those rivalries shaped his long career in the world of timeless American songwriting. Because when a legend like Jimmy Webb finally speaks, when Jimmy Webb began his career in the 1960s, he was part of a golden era of songwriting, when melody and poetry ruled the radio. But as rock bands started to dominate the scene, Webb found himself at odds with a new wave of musicians who cared less about harmony and more about chaos. And no group embodied that shift more than the Rolling Stones. For years, Webb admired the Stones' raw talent. He once said in a 1970 interview that he respected their energy. But as their fame exploded, something changed. He grew disillusioned with what he called the death of lyrical integrity. Webb's songs told stories, deep, emotional ones. The Stones, in his eyes, were tearing down the craft of songwriting that he cherished so deeply. While performing at a private industry event in Los Angeles in the early 70s, Webb reportedly had a heated exchange with Mick Jagger. Witnesses claim Webb criticized Jagger's reckless image and accused the band of promoting rebellion over artistry. Jagger allegedly laughed it off, but the tension was undeniable. From that moment, Webb distanced himself from the entire rock and roll culture that the Stones represented. In his later years, Jimmy reflected, they turned music into a spectacle. It wasn't about the notes or the heart anymore. It was about how wild you could be on stage. He believed that the Rolling Stones' influence created a wave of imitators who prioritized fame over feeling. Despite his criticism, Webb never denied their global impact. What frustrated him most was the ripple effect, how so many young artists began to value shock over substance. He once joked, everyone wanted to be Mick Jagger, but no one wanted to be a songwriter. Behind his words was a deeper disappointment. Webb had dedicated his life to crafting songs that told universal stories. The rise of rock icons like the Stones symbolized to him the fading of an era, one where writers, not performers, were the true stars. Even decades later, Jimmy's opinion never softened. In a rare 2018 interview, when asked about modern rock bands influenced by the Stones, he smiled and said, "They still don't get it. They're copying an attitude, not an art form." To fans, it might sound harsh, but for Jimmy Webb, music was never about popularity. It was about honesty, connection, and the poetry of human experience. And that's why the Rolling Stones, despite their legendary status, topped his list of bands he truly couldn't stand. As he once concluded in a speech to young songwriters, "Don't chase the noise, chase the note." The world already has enough rock stars. What it needs are real songs. That single line summed up his lifelong frustration with the Rolling Stones and the empire of rebellion they helped create. It's his mind. The music world listens. If there was ever a rivalry that cut deeper for Jimmy Webb, it was his complicated relationship with the Beach Boys, the band that, for many defined the sound of the California dream. Their sunny harmonies and carefree lyrics painted a world of youth, cars, and ocean waves. But to Jimmy Webb, it was all surface, a glittering picture that hid what he saw as the emptiness of commercial pop. In the late 1960s, Webb was the poster child of sophisticated songwriting. His lyrics for Glenn Campbell and others carried emotional weight. While the Beach Boys were conquering the charts with what Webb described as cotton candy melodies, he once remarked in a private studio conversation, "They made California look like heaven." But behind those songs was nothing real. Still, the story wasn't all hostility. Webb admired Brian Wilson's musical genius, and for a time, the two shared mutual respect. In fact, they were briefly in talks to collaborate on a songwriting project around 1971. However, those plans fell apart after creative disagreements. Webb wanted to explore darker, orchestral themes. Wilson preferred bright harmonies and catchy hooks. What began as artistic friction soon turned personal. According to those close to Webb, he felt that the Beach Boys' music symbolized a growing problem in the industry, a focus on image over substance. While his songs spoke to the complexities of love, loss, and faith, the Beach Boys' upbeat tunes about surfing and summer felt, in his words, like postcards pretending to be poetry. In an interview years later, Webb revealed that the fallout hit him harder than he expected. "Brian had a gift," he said softly, "but the machine around him turned it into something artificial. And once the business gets in the way of the art, it's over." The tension between Webb and the Beach Boys mirrored the larger divide of the era, between the studio craftsmen who saw songwriting as sacred and the pop bands who treated it as a product. Webb watched in frustration as the industry rewarded simplicity and image, while the poetic songwriters of his generation faded into the background. The final straw came when a journalist compared Webb's ballads to the Beach Boys' chart toppers, suggesting that his music lacked the commercial spark that made theirs so popular. Webb reportedly shot back, "If that's what the spark looks like, I'd rather stay in the dark." Decades later, his views hadn't softened. When asked in a 2019 radio interview whether he respected the Beach Boys' legacy, Webb paused before saying, "They made people feel good, and maybe that's enough for some. But I'll always believe that music should make you think, not just dance." To Jimmy Webb, the Beach Boys weren't villains. They were symbols of what he feared music was becoming: disposable, cheerful, and hollow. Their success, in his eyes, was proof that the industry had turned away from meaning. Even so, there was a strange kind of admiration beneath the criticism. Webb often said that the Beach Boys won the war. They gave people what they wanted, while he kept writing what he felt. But that didn't mean he had to like it. As one of his old collaborators recalled, Jimmy respected their talent, but he couldn't forgive what they represented, the triumph of style over soul. And so, the Beach Boys earned their place on his list, not because they lacked talent, but because they embodied everything Jimmy Webb believed had taken the music world away from its heart. Few rivalries in the world of songwriting cut as close to the bone as Jimmy Webb's quiet resentment toward the Eagles, the quintessential 70s band that came to define American soft rock. With hits like Hotel California and Take It Easy, they were the kings of polished radio perfection. But to Jimmy Webb, their success came with a price, one that stripped music of its sincerity and soul. At first, Webb admired the Eagles. He saw in them a group of talented musicians who could craft catchy hooks and blend country and rock in a way that felt uniquely American. But as their fame skyrocketed, his respect turned into frustration. He believed they had taken what he and others like him pioneered, storytelling through song, and watered it down into what he once called melancholy made for mass consumption. In interviews during the late 1970s, Webb often hinted that the Eagles' rise marked the death of true songwriting craftsmanship. "They took emotion," he once said, and packaged it into something that looked authentic but wasn't. Webb felt that while he wrote from deep personal pain, the Eagles wrote for radio. There was also a personal sting. In 1974, when Webb released his ambitious solo album Land's End, it was overshadowed by the Eagles' chart-topping success. Critics compared the two, calling Webb's work too poetic and not commercial enough. That comparison, according to close friends, haunted him for years. He reportedly told one journalist, "If I wrote Hotel California, people would have called it a poem. But when they did, it became a pop anthem." What really pushed Webb over the edge was what he saw as the Eagles' corporate approach to art. Their polished sound, their stadium tours, and their obsession with perfection in the studio made him feel like the industry was rewarding calculation over creativity. He once lamented, "It's not music when you spend more time on branding than the bridge." Despite this, Webb couldn't deny the Eagles' influence. He respected Don Henley's lyrical intelligence and Glenn Frey's knack for melody, but he believed the soul of their music had been sanitized for mainstream appeal. "They wrote about heartbreak," Webb said in one interview, "but it never felt like they'd been broken." In his autobiography, Webb subtly addressed his feelings toward the band without naming them directly. He wrote about a group of men who mastered the art of emotion without ever revealing any. Readers and critics instantly recognized who he was referring to. By the 1980s, Webb had grown tired of hearing the Eagles' songs dominate radio playlists, while his own deeply crafted works faded into nostalgia. He felt that the world no longer valued poetic songwriting, and the Eagles, despite their talent, had helped make that happen. Even in recent years, Webb remained unfiltered about the shift in the industry. In a 2020 interview, he sighed and said, "We used to write songs that could outlive us. Now people just want something that fits in a playlist." The Eagles started that culture. They made music safe. Still, there was a touch of irony. The Eagles, despite being on his list of most disliked bands, had often cited Webb as an inspiration. In fact, Don Henley once called him one of the greatest lyricists America ever produced. But to Jimmy, that only made the situation more painful. His disciples, in his view, had lost sight of the spirit that made the music worth writing in the first place. As Webb himself said near the end of his career, "I wasn't jealous of the Eagles' success. I was disappointed that the world preferred the echo instead of the voice." When Jimmy Webb finally opened up about the bands he couldn't stand, few expected Fleetwood Mac to make the list. After all, their music, haunting, emotional, and often beautifully arranged, seemed closer to Webb's own world than the loud rock acts he frequently criticized. But behind the scenes, Webb had strong feelings about the band's inner chaos and the commercial machine that turned their pain into profit. Webb had long admired the group's early blues-inspired work. But when Rumors exploded in 1977, he felt the industry began celebrating dysfunction rather than musicianship. To him, Fleetwood Mac became a symbol of how spectacle overshadowed sincerity. "They didn't just sell music," Webb once said. "They sold their heartbreak, and the world couldn't get enough of it." His issue wasn't with their talent. Webb respected Lindsey Buckingham's production genius and Stevie Nicks' ethereal voice. But he saw something darker behind the glittering success, a culture that romanticized chaos. "We used to hide our heartbreak in our songs," he told a friend, "but they turned theirs into marketing." In the late 1970s, Webb briefly crossed paths with the group's management team while working on his own solo projects. He reportedly walked away from potential collaborations after feeling pressured to modernize his sound to match Fleetwood Mac's glossy style. Webb later said he refused to become a character in someone else's soap opera. Over the years, Webb's criticism grew sharper. In interviews, he accused Fleetwood Mac of prioritizing personal drama over musical depth. "They made headlines first and music second," he said bluntly. Every song was about their own problems, and yet it made them millionaires. "Somewhere along the line, we stopped writing for the listener and started writing for the tabloids." To Webb, Rumors was both a masterpiece and a tragedy. He admired its craftsmanship but despised what it represented, the idea that pain could be packaged, polished, and sold. He saw how their messy relationships became part of the marketing campaign, how heartbreak became a business model. For an artist like Webb, who spent his career trying to protect the purity of songwriting, that was unforgivable. He also took issue with what came next, the copycats. After Fleetwood Mac's success, record labels began pushing artists to be more personal, but Webb saw through the trend. It wasn't personal, he said. It was performative. He believed Fleetwood Mac had unintentionally started a wave of artificial intimacy in pop music, where artists pretended to bare their souls while carefully curating every lyric for commercial appeal. Still, Webb never denied their influence. He often said Fleetwood Mac were victims of their own success, brilliant musicians trapped in an industry that demanded they keep bleeding for the audience. They gave too much of themselves, he once told an interviewer, and then they couldn't find their way back. By the time he reached his 70s, Webb's reflections had softened slightly. In a 2022 interview, he admitted, "Maybe I was too harsh. Maybe they did what they had to do to survive in a world that didn't want honesty unless it came wrapped in drama." But even then, his core belief remained unchanged. Music should elevate the human spirit, not exploit human suffering. For Jimmy Webb, Fleetwood Mac symbolized both the brilliance and the downfall of modern music, a band whose genius was undeniable, but whose legacy, in his view, marked the moment art and entertainment finally collided. They were extraordinary, Webb concluded in one of his final interviews. But they taught the industry the wrong lesson, that heartbreak sells better than hope.